The smile that finally twisted his lips was almost feral. "This should be interesting." Creature popped back in and set her basket down on the floor. "I had got them all, master. There's enough potion in the basket to replenish the blood of 4 people. We might not need all of it, but I'm sure we'll use plenty," Harry told him. "Now listen carefully, Creature. This is what I'll need you to do." Several minutes later, he looked at Ron, who took a deep breath and nodded. "Go for it, Harry. Creature!" "I'm ready, master," the elf told him, his eyes gleaming eagerly. "And if I forget, know that Creature thanks you for allowing him to play." Nodding, Harry took a deep breath and raised his wand. He cast 5 summoning spells in rapid succession, but did not put his wand away. Ron had drawn his own and waited tensely. "I hope this works. At least I think I do." "Of course you do. This solves all our problems," Harry told him. "Not quite, mate," Ron said seriously. "Not if you actually want a life of your own." Sighing, Harry nodded. "I know, but that can come later." "How long do you think it will take?" "I don't know." "Ah, Harry, maybe we should have warned Hermione." "Why? She can't possibly have anything left to throw up." "No, but I wouldn't put it past her to hex us to death when she finds out. And that's assuming she doesn't come back in the middle of this." I hadn't thought of that. Too late now. I suppose," he said casually, though his shoulders were starting to ache with tension. "I'll remind you of that when we're searching for your balls," Ron said with a tense grin. "They're coming," Creature said, his voice distant. "What? How do you know?" Harry asked, his eyes glued to the window. "Creature can feel when magic approaches. He is tied to the walls around the house. They come. Prepare yourselves." His stance widened as if bracing for an impact, and he held his hands up, ready to strike. Ron jumped out of his chair and trained his wand on the window. "I hope you know what we're doing, Harry." "Me too." "What the hell are you two doing now?" Hermione exclaimed from the doorway. Ron spun around so suddenly that he nearly lost his balance. "Oh, fuck me, Hermione. Not now." Turning back to the window, he raised his wand and glanced at Harry. "We're screwed," he muttered. Later, Harry growled. Hermione shrieked and drew her wand. "More body parts! You two are in so much shit when this is over. The wall!" Harry blurted. "Cushion the wall quickly, Hermione." With a violent swish of her wand, she did as she was asked, then turned to face the window again, just as something else flew in. Biting back another scream, she looked closely at the thing as it hit the wall and hissed in disgust. "An arm!" "You summoned a bloody arm." "It wasn't bloody until after the summoning," Ron told her. "Stuff it, Ron. I swear when I'm done with the two of you, you'll wish you'd never been born. Arms. You're both insane." "Not just arms," Harry told her. "Something flew the window and hit the wall." "Legs, too," Ron said. "One more, then the main event arrives." "What main event?" Hermione exclaimed angrily. Later, Ron and Harry both growled. The second leg shot through the window and smacked gently into the wall across the room. "This is it," Harry said. Growling, Hermione tensed herself and trained her wand on the wall, where the next thing through the window was sure to land. She still had no idea what was going on, but a cushioning charm for arms and legs seemed stupid and a bit disturbing to her. After all, Harry had preserved a mass of flesh. There was no telling what he was planning to do with a bunch of limbs. A distant shrieking could be heard through the window. Hermione's eyes widened and she felt the blood drain from her face. "You didn't! Killing someone is one thing, but this!" she gasped. "You're both insane!" "No killing!" Harry shouted, stunning only. The shrieking had grown closer with each passing second, until it and its source shot through the window and hit the cushioned wall with a loud smack. It bounced off the wall and fell to the table as Harry's spell flew, hitting the thing in the chest. The shrieking stopped and Creature was moving. He climbed onto the table, and with quick, efficient, and incredibly vicious movements, he stopped the thing from bleeding by cauterizing the wounds with fire. The smell of burnt flesh filled the air, and, for the third time that night, Hermione gagged and fled the room. But she'd gotten a good enough look at the thing on the table to realize exactly what her best friends had done. It hadn't changed her mind, either. They were both insane. Harry picked up the basket of potions and took them to Creature. "How do we do this if he's unconscious?" "Elves must be able to administer potions, no matter the circumstances," Creature told him as he uncorked several bottles and lined them up. Then, placing his hand over the throat of the person on the table, he picked up a bottle and looked at Harry. "Normally, another elf would help Creature with this. You need to open his mouth." Nodding, Harry put his thumb on the man's chin and pulled it down. Tipping the bottle up, Creature monitored his patient carefully. The hand he'd placed over his patient's throat glowed brightly as he manipulated the muscles, causing the man swallowed rapidly. Several bottles later, Creature removed his hand from his patient's throat and sat back. "He will live!" Ron and Harry glanced at Creature, then stared at each other. "It worked?" Ron asked. "It certainly looks that way," Harry said quietly. "But what do we do with him? I hadn't really thought that far ahead, to be honest." Creature put the empty bottles in the basket and climbed down off the table. "If the master would allow, Creature has an idea." "What is it?" Harry and Ron listened to the elf, occasionally interrupting him with bouts of laughter. When he was finished, both teens grinned. "An excellent idea, Creature. It solves several problems. Hiss!" a rival caused. Harry praised. The elf looked up at Harry, his eyes bright with respect. "Creature is proud to know he is owned by such a strong wizard." He bowed low, then looked up once more. "I will be back with the necessary item." With that, he disappeared. "Explain," Hermione said hoarsely, leaning heavily against the doorframe. Harry's brow wrinkled in concern as he looked at her. She was pale and sweaty, and her hair hung limply for once. "Are you all right? Maybe you should sit down," Ron added. Pushing away from the doorway, she waved away their concern and wobbled toward them. "What were you thinking?" "Thinking? I was thinking I'd just solved a problem," Harry told her. "And created a boatload more," she exclaimed. "I don't see how," Harry said. "Me?" either Ron added. "It's not like anyone will know what we've done, at least not until Harry's ready for them to." She looked at them incredulously. "You don't think anyone going to notice that the Dark Lord is missing?" Ron and Harry looked at each other for a moment, then turned back to her and shrugged. "It's not like one of his minions is going to drop into the Dummel and file a missing persons report on him," Harry said, grinning. Dobby appeared with a pop. "Dinner is served," he announced proudly. "Oh, God! Not again!" Hermione gasped as she clutched at her stomach. "You can't possibly have anything left to throw up," Ron said with a roll of his eyes. She drew her wand so fast she startled both boys. In a blink she had Ron disarmed, silenced, and vomiting slugs the size of large eels. Harry's nose crinkled. "How did you do that?" Last time the slugs were rather small, because he cast with a broken wand. Hermione muttered as she watched the red head gag and vomit. Ron's knees gave out and he hit the floor as another slug emerged. "I hope he doesn't choke," Harry said, concerned. Dobby, who'd managed to take in the damage to the library, looked up at Harry. "Will you be wanting dinner tonight?" "We'll be along shortly," Harry told him. When the elf left, he glanced at Ron, then looked at Hermione. She was pale and a bit shaky, but she was watching Ron with a great deal of satisfaction. "You know, I think I'll talk to Dobby about serving eel tomorrow night," he told her. She clutched her stomach and grit her teeth. "Bastard!" she growled before running from the room. Dinner was a quiet affair. Hermione was no longer nauseous, thanks to a potion Dobby had brought her, but she still hadn't touched any food. She sat with them at the table, drinking tea occasionally and watching both boys. Harry had removed the spell Hermione had cast, and Ron was no longer vomiting slugs. The slugs hadn't killed Ron's appetite, and he was currently shoveling food into his mouth at his normal pace. Harry ate slowly, pausing now and then to look up at the ceiling thoughtfully. "I have a question," Hermione asked suddenly. "You summoned the Dark Lord's limbs, then his body. How did he survive the trip?" Both boys looked at her oddly, and she sighed. "There are arteries in the limbs. He should have bled out and died before he arrived." Harry shook his head. "You're forgetting that he's not human anymore, Hermione. Not really. The rebirthing fluid in the graveyard contained Wormtail's hand, a bone from Voldemort's father, and my blood, along with some other ingredients I'm not sure about." Hermione frowned. "Maybe it was the addition of your blood that helped him survive his limbless jaunt to headquarters then." "What makes you think that?" Ron asked. "Harry survived the killing curse as a toddler. Having one's limbs ripped off has got to be a piece of cake in comparison," she said, shrugging. "My, aren't we blahs all of a sudden?" Harry muttered. "What?" "You have a better explanation?" she asked. He thought about that for a moment. Magic. Seeing her look, he cringed back. "We'll go with your explanation," he said, holding up both hands to ward her off. She sniffed and turned back to her tea. Ron's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and he looked at Harry. "Do you remember how you blew up your Aunt Marge?" Harry blinked. No, not really. I was angry, but hadn't meant to do anything like that." "Why?" "I was just thinking. We could tie a string to him, then inflate him." Imagine walking around Diagon Alley with your very own Voldemort balloon. Harry began to choke on his laughter, and he pushed his plate away. Brilliant, Ron! Hermione exclaimed. Would you be serious? Why? He asked, looking at her curiously. Harry's managed to solve the biggest problem he had. It's not like the Dark Lord can hurt him now. He doesn't have his wand. Even if he did, he has no way to hold it. Do you have any idea how many laws have been broken tonight? Hermione asked angrily. The Ministry is infested with Death Eaters. Do you honestly think they'll look kindly on us for what we've done? We could always summon them in the same manner, Ron joked. They could be company for Voldemort. Harry's laughter grew louder, and he leaned weakly against the table. Would you stop that? Hermione growled. This is serious. Sliding sideways, Harry fell out of his chair and hit the floor with a thud. Ron and Hermione both stood up and looked at him in concern. You okay? Ron asked. Harry looked up at them. Tears of mirth slid down his cheeks, and he sucked in a breath. Merlin, don't you see? If we could do this to the Dark Lord himself, his Death Eaters don't stand a chance. He closed his eyes for a moment, then laughed once more. I'm free, Ron grinned. Yeah, mate, you are. Hermione stared at Harry for a long moment. Then her shoulders slumped. I'm sorry, Harry. I wasn't thinking of what this would mean for you. Waving that away, Harry climbed back into his chair. That's all right. Ron had some warning about what I was doing. You walked into the middle of it. Sitting down once more, she shook her head. Maybe, but that's not an excuse. Ron gathered up the dishes on the table and sent them towards the sink with a flick of his wand. Don't worry about it, Hermione. You were shocked and off balance. You were also right, in one way, Harry said. Now that it's over, I'm not sure what to do with him. The prophecy says, Hermione began. Harry scowled. Yeah, I know what it says. But I'm no more willing to subject myself to the whim of prophecy than I am to bow to Dumbledore's machinations. I'm not willing to kill a man who is no threat to me. He can't hurt me any longer. Killing him now makes me a murderer. Ron set the dishes to washing and sat down. He looked at Hermione for a moment, then turned to Harry. So what now? Who knew I'd be spending the last 2 weeks of summer living in a house with my 2 best friends and the Dark Lord? Hermione muttered. The Dark Lord? Harry asked, his eyes bright with laughter. You mean the Dark Torso, don't you? Ron's jaw dropped, and he stared at Harry. The Dark Torso, he mumbled, testing it for himself. Blood brilliant. Hermione lay her head on the table, and her shoulders shook slightly. The Dark Torso, she choked. Merlin, he'd kill you for that. If he had arms, or legs, Ron added, then began to laugh. Or his wand, Harry said, watching them both and smiling. Creature popped into the kitchen and bowed to Harry. Master's guest is as comfortable as Creature can make him. Creature had to stuff pillows into the trunk to keep Master's guest upright, as he kept falling over on his face. He then grinned at the now hysterical teens and danced a small jig. Creature has never enjoyed himself this much before. Calming himself, Harry straightened and smiled down at the elf. I'm glad you're having fun. His care will be your responsibility now. No one outside this house is to know he's here. Not even Moody, he warned. Yes, Master. Creature will take care of everything. If Master has no objections, Creature will move his things into the attic now. I have no objections. Thanks, Creature. Master is welcome, Creature said, bowing. Once the elf left, the 3 teens looked at each other again. Well, I suppose we have to come up with some sort of plan, Harry said. We can't leave Creature in charge without directions. We also need to get in touch with Ginny, Hermione added. Why? Ron asked curiously. To let her know Operation Overthrow is no longer needed. Why wouldn't it be needed? Harry asked. Because the Dark Lord has been neutralized, Hermione said. But Dumbledore hasn't been, Ron told her. As far as he knows, Voldemort is still out there, as dangerous as ever. Yeah, but once Harry announces that the Dark Lord has been... She trailed off as Harry shook his head. But I'm not going to announce anything, he said. Dumbledore will insist that I kill Voldemort to fulfill his stupid prophecy, and I have no intention of doing so. You're going ahead with Operation Overthrow, then? She asked, puzzled. It's the only way to make sure Dumbledore understands that I won't let him meddle in my life any longer. His lips twitched slightly. Besides, I think I'm entitled to have a little fun, Hermione began. Wait, hear me out, he said. Dumbledore may have been a great headmaster at one time, but that time is over. Look at everything we've been through. He obviously isn't very concerned about the safety of his students. Our education doesn't seem to be a priority for him either. If it was, Snape, Trelawney, and Binns would have been replaced ages ago. That's not fair, Harry, Ron said seriously. Binns is very good at teaching us all how to nap in class. Harry laughed. True. Hermione fought a smile. Even she had problems staying awake in history of magic. I understand what you're saying and agree with most of it. But what about the 5th and 7th year students? Those tests are very important. We'll have to meet with the DAR when school starts. Maybe we could exclude those students who have tests this year, Ron suggested. Possibly, but if Operation Overthrow is successful, the teachers will be so distracted they won't be doing their best for the students, Hermione pointed out. Harry raked a hand through his hair. I don't know. Maybe, if we do this right, the board will offer some sort of compensation for the testing students. What do you mean? Hermione asked. Well, if we manage to get Dumbledore tossed out, the board may look at the circumstances and reschedule their tests or something. Do you really think it's wise to hinge their future on a maybe? No, Ron told her, but I do think they should make their own choices. After all, the objective of this hasn't changed. Dumbledore needs to go. Let's make sure they understand that this could affect their test scores and let them make up their own minds. She sat back on her chair and nibbled her lower lip. That might work. All right, now that we have that settled, Harry said. What do we do with our guest while we're at school? Why can't Creature take care of him? Ron asked. He could, but he'll need some sort of instructions, I think. There's no telling what he'd do on his own. There's not much that needs to be done, really, Hermione said. Feed him and keep him clean and quiet. Harry scowled. Yeah, well, I'm not sure I like the idea of feeding and caring for the Dark Torso. He's caused me nothing but grief. If I were a bit more sadistic, I'd order daily torture. Unfortunately, I can't justify doing that to someone who can't defend himself. Hermione exhaled, unaware she'd actually been holding her breath. You know, Muggles sometimes study the criminally insane. Too bad we couldn't do something like that with him, Harry mused. Handing him over to a lab for testing would be amusing. Ron's eyes widened. Ah, Harry, there might be something we can do. What do you have in mind? The twins, the redhead told him. Hermione's brow furrowed. What about them? Harry blinked several times, then grinned. They're always looking for test subjects, aren't they? Now, wait a minute, Hermione began. Yes, they are, Ron replied, ignoring Hermione as she began to sputter. And just think, the greatest Dark Lord of all time being reduced to a test subject for pranks and jokes. The darkest menace to our world being responsible for product safety. Come on, what's not to like? Hermione opened her mouth, intent on blasting both boys into next year, but all that came out was a wheeze. When they looked at her oddly, she coughed to clear her throat and tried again. She giggled instead. Ron grinned and looked at Harry. She's in? So what do you think? I think there's something slightly twisted about you, Harry said, shaking his head. It's morally wrong, bordering on contemptible and quite probably illegal. But the only question I find myself able to ask is, how long do you think it would take the twins to get here? Ron laughed. A note from you would bring them here about 5 minutes after they received it. Harry looked at Hermione. Well, she shook her head. God, I used to be such a nice, law-abiding girl. Now I find myself hoping the twins will take pictures during their product test. The trio looked at each other and began to laugh. Hogwarts. Dumbledore sat on the couch in Snape's private quarters, pinching the bridge of his nose. He was tired and had no idea how to solve the problem he was now faced with. They'd managed to stop the bleeding on Snape's arm and partially heal the injury without having to call on Poppy's aid. The Mediwitch would have asked questions that neither man was willing to answer. Snape now sat in an armchair across from him, a brandy glass in his hand. He sipped from it occasionally, but his eyes never left the headmaster. Dumbledore looked at his potions, Professor, and took a deep breath. You can feel nothing from Voldemort. Snape shook his head. Since the Dark Lord's rebirth, every Death Eater had been able to feel his presence through the mark. With it gone, Snape closed his eyes. Albus, the next time he summons me, he will think I am deliberately ignoring him. And it's not as though you could inform him that the mark was removed. Ending my life as a pile of goo at the Dark Lord's feet was not really in my plans, Snape agreed. What am I to do now? How did this happen? I do not know how it happened, Severus, but one thing is clear. Dumbledore's eyes bore into Snape's. From this moment on, you are not to leave the Hogwarts grounds. Grimmauld. After breakfast the next morning, Harry sent Hedwig off with a note to the twins, then called for Critcher. When the elf appeared, he asked about their guest. I had to leave the silencing charm on him. The elf explained. He wouldn't stop screaming. He finally fell asleep a few hours ago. Excellent. The Weasley twins will be here this morning. I want you to modify the ward so they can come in. Critcher scowled. Yes, but you're like them. Critcher doubts that. You're allowed to have doubts. What you're not allowed, Harry said firmly, is to harm them or be rude to them. The only person you're allowed to be rude to is the guy in the trunk upstairs. Do you understand? Critcher grumbled a bit, but finally acknowledged the command. Once he had modified the ward, he asked to be excused. Ron entered the kitchen as Critcher popped away. How was his night with the dark torso? He asked. Quiet, thanks to a silencing charm, Harry said. He finished his juice, then pushed his glass away. Even though I know he can't hurt us, I found myself having trouble sleeping last night, Ron told him as he sat down. He leaned back when Dobby slid a plate in front of him. I now understand what Hermione meant. Spending the rest of the summer in the same house as the Dark Lord is a little creepy. Harry remained silent as Ron filled his plate. There wasn't much he could say, really. Did you send a note to the twins? The redhead asked. Yeah, and had Critcher modify the wards. They should be here soon. Who should? Hermione asked as she entered the kitchen. The twins? Ron told her, his mouth full of food. She wrinkled her nose. Chew first, please, she said as she filled her cup with tea. Dobby placed a plate of toast in front of her, and she smiled her thanks. You know, you might want to think about changing the wards again, Harry. Why? He asked. Moody still has access. Don't get me wrong. I trust him. But he'd be able to see your guest. Harry rubbed his ear. True. What difference does it make? He'd be able to stand outside and see in, Ron told them. Crap! I hadn't thought of that, Harry said. Hermione frowned. Me either, Critcher, Harry called. The elf popped in a moment later, scowling. The master called. Yes, we have a bit of a problem. I don't want Moody knowing about old Limbless upstairs. I know you can change the wards so he can't get in, and I want you to do that. But that won't keep him from seeing into the house if he's outside. I don't know enough about how his eye functions to fix that problem. Critcher can ward the attic so Peg-Leg can't see, the elf explained. Do so, please. I don't want him coming in or seeing anything. Nodding, Critcher modified the house wards once more, then popped back to the attic. Who knew he'd changed so much? Ron commented after Critcher left. We've all changed, Harry said quietly. When they looked at him questioningly, he shrugged and stood up. Critcher's not as twisted as he was, but we're not as straight-laced either. If we were, we wouldn't have our guest upstairs and the twins wouldn't be coming over. Speak for yourself, Hermione said with a huff. I had nothing to do with the torso upstairs. Harry patted her on the head gently as he passed by on the way out of the kitchen. You keep telling yourself that, she growled as he left the kitchen. He's got a point, Ron said as he pushed his plate away and stood up. There's nothing to stop you from leaving the house and telling the world about what's going on. Nothing but your friendship with us anyway. He leaned over and grinned. You're in this up to your bushy little head. The only thing you're having a problem with is the fact that you're enjoying it as much as we are. She threw a piece of toast at him. Shut up, you prat! Laughing, he walked out of the kitchen. See you in the library, he called. Picking up the last piece of toast on her plate, she bit into it savagely. I hate it when he's right, she muttered around her food. Blinking, she tossed the bread down and stood up. God, even my manners are slipping. Refilling her cup with tea, she left the kitchen. Dobby popped into the library half an hour later and announced that the twins had arrived, but seemed reluctant to enter. Hermione looked up for her new potions text and smiled. They're probably afraid of getting the Dumbledore treatment if they try to open the door. I'll get them, Ron said as he stood up. Have you figured out what you're going to tell them, Harry? The truth, I suppose, he said. He marked his place in his transfiguration text and closed it. Not much point in lying, really. Nodding, Ron left the library. Harry turned to Dobby and spoke with him quietly. The elf nodded, then popped away. Ron came back a few minutes later, a disgusted look on his face and the twins on his heels. They insisted on giving me their wands, he answered Harry's questioning look. Dumping said wands on the table, he sat down. We just wanted to make sure Harry felt safe, George explained. We saw part of what you did to Snape, Fred said. Neither one of us is all that interested in a tattoo. Harry's methods of revenge have grown a bit more exotic since then, Hermione said, grinning. I appreciate the thought, Harry told them, but it's really not necessary. Take your wands and sit down. Shrugged. The twins did as they were told. So, does this have anything to do with Operation Overthrow? Fred asked. Yes and no, Harry said. Well, so long as we're clear on that, George said with a laugh. Harry grinned. Oh, I don't know. Ambiguity has its place. Yes, but this isn't it, Hermione grumbled. Would you just tell them? It's not exactly something you just blurt out, Ron said. Why not? She asked. Because they probably won't believe it. So, it's not like we don't have proof. As they continued to argue, the twins watched avidly. It was obvious something big had happened. Shaking his head, Harry turned to the twins, ignoring the arguing pair. I'll give you the basics and fill in the details later. Hermione and Ron stopped arguing and sat back to watch the twins. Seems I had a block on my magic. Never mind the hows or whys for the moment. The block was removed and I have a bit more power now. When Ron snorted a laugh, he scowled at him, then continued, Yesterday evening, Ron and I came up with an idea involving the summoning charm. To test it, I summoned my cousin's computer. He pointed to the wrecked machine near one bookcase, then shrugged. It worked, so I tried to summon Pettigrew's heart. The twins grew goggle-eyed. Before you ask, no, we don't think it worked, at least not like we'd hoped. Hermione explained that even if the summoning did work, Pettigrew's heart is likely in several pieces, as it would have been forced through his ribs. Ron and I did a bit of brainstorming after that and decided to leave off summoning internal organs. Instead, we thought about external body parts. To test it, I summoned Snape's dark mark. Dobby! Harry called. The elf popped in and handed him something wrapped in a towel. He nodded his thanks, then unwrapped the item. Grimacing slightly, he then handed it to George. There, preserved in a picture frame like some deranged memento, was Severus Snape's dark mark. The twins started at it, then looked at each other, blinking. George carefully placed the frame on the table, then both twins leaned back on their chairs and began to laugh. Harry looked at his two best friends. Ron was grinning at his brothers, while Hermione was shaking her head and refusing to look at the thing on the table. Wiping the tears of mirth from his eyes, Fred looked at Harry. I don't suppose there was any way of getting pictures of the event. That would be brilliant, George said. Sorry, guys, no pictures. But if you're really interested, I can show you the memory of the event, Harry offered. Just make sure you don't eat anything before you see it, Hermione grumbled. Just because you vomited doesn't mean they will, Ron told her. That was definitely worth closing the shop for, Fred said before Hermione could reply. Actually, I haven't gotten to the main reason for inviting you here, Harry said. There's more. He's saving the best for last, Ron told his brothers. If you like that last bit, you'll love what's coming next. Ah, right, Harry said. See, since the mark could be summoned, we thought, why not go a bit further? Further, the twins asked, both leaning forward. Harry shrugged. I summoned Voldemort's wand. The library fell silent as the twins stared at him in awe. You have his wand? Fred finally asked. Ron began to laugh. Oh, you two are so going to love this, he chortled. George shook his head. Harry, that was really smart. I'm sure he'll be able to go get another one, but the fit won't be the same, will it? No, I didn't think he'll be able to get another. Harry's really disarmed him this time, Hermione said, then began to snicker. Fred looked at her, though he spoke to Harry. That will give you a real advantage when you face him, he said slowly. Harry bit his lip and turned away. And you won't have to worry about the whole Brother Wands issue, George continued, though he looked puzzled. I hadn't thought of that, Fred said. He tilted his head slightly and looked at the trio oddly. Hermione was biting her fist, trying to stifle her laughter. Ron was laughing outright, and Harry had his head on the table, though his shoulders were shaking. All right, so what are we missing? Fred asked. Something Harry hasn't gotten to yet, I guess, George said. Harry raised a hand and pointed at George. Right, so you want to let us in on the joke? Fred asked. Sitting up a few moments later, Harry bit back his laughter and smiled at the twins. Sorry, that was rude of us. Not at all, dear fellow, George said magnanimously. We know you'll get to it eventually. Hermione wiped the tears from her eyes. Generous of you. It was, rather, Fred agreed. So you have Voldemort's wand, George said. What else? The trio looked at each other for a moment, then turned back to the twins. We have his legs, Harry said. And his arms, Ron added. And the rest of him, Hermione concluded. Ah? What? George asked. Fred shook his head. I think they've gone crackers. George's eyes narrowed. Possibly, but let's hear them out. Sighing, Harry sat back on his chair. We're serious. After summoning his wand, I summoned his arms, then his legs, then him. He somehow managed to survive the trip, though it was close. I stunned him once he arrived, and Creature stopped his bleeding. We poured several bottles of blood-replenishing potion down his throat, and he's now tucked away upstairs, furious but helpless. The twins stared at him for a few moments. I think Mum was right, George muttered. Being alone in this house has driven them all nuts. Hermione rolled her eyes. It's not like we can't prove it to you. They looked at her doubtfully. Harry pushed away from the table and stood up. Come on, then. He's in the attic. As he walked out of the room, Ron followed him. The twins frowned at each other, then stood up. You're not coming? Fred asked Hermione. I've seen him, she said. Opening her potions text, she shook her head. Trust me, once was enough. Shrugging, he trotted out to catch up with his brothers and Harry. Sometime later, a very embarrassed-looking Harry entered the library with the Weasley brothers in tow. Hermione lowered her book and raised an eyebrow when they entered. Ron was grinning unabashedly, while the twins looked at Harry with awe. You did it, Fred said quietly. You actually did it. You captured the Dark Lord. The Dark Torso, Hermione corrected as Harry slid into the chair next to her. When the twins swung their gazes to her, she shrugged. Harry thought the name change appropriate, considering the man no longer has his limbs. Brilliant, George breathed. Harry, do you realize what you've done? Fred asked, his eyes wide. You single-handedly ended the war. You've captured the worst Dark Lord ever known, without bloodshed. Not true, Ron said. There was a lot of blood. It was all Voldemort's, and it's a miracle he survived. But there was bloodshed. George waved that away. That doesn't count. The asshole deserved to bleed, and so much more. Honestly, I don't think Harry understands the magnitude of what he's done. He turned to stare at Harry once more. You showed us all in the day that you were a great leader. His gaze turned a bit fatuous. But this proves that you're a god. They'll erect statues of him in Diagon Alley and at the Ministry, Fred said quietly, his eyes on Harry. They'll hold parades and parties in his name. He'll be more famous than Merlin. The twins looked at each other for a moment, while Harry squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. And when the world finds out that he's been a silent partner in Weasley's wizarding wheezes since the beginning, business will boom, George exclaimed. Including him as a partner was the smartest thing we ever did. The most famous wizard of all time endorsing our business. We're brilliant, Fred added. With a laugh, the twins began dancing a jig around the room. Ron watched his brothers for a moment, then shook his head. I think they've been testing too many of their own products. Mama Hermione hummed, watching the brothers cavort around the library. So, did you tell them the rest of the plan? Not yet, Harry said, scowling. They kept going on about how great I am. It made me so uncomfortable that I didn't get around to it. They wouldn't even listen when I told them that Ron helped me come up with the idea, or that you taught me the spell that made it possible. Hermione blinked. Don't pull me into this. I had nothing to do with it. Harry snorted. You keep telling yourself that. She looked between her two best friends, then shook her head. There are days that I truly wish the troll had won. The boys simply grinned at her. She was lying, and they knew it. So, Ron said loudly, do you think the twins want to hear about our plans? Or should we leave them to their dancing? The twins came to a halt mid-jig and looked at him. Plan? They asked. It's simple, really, Harry told them. You're always looking for test subjects for your products, and I happen to have a house guest who needs to earn his keep. When the twins' eyes went wide and glassy, Hermione began to snicker. Hold on to something, Harry. They're about to start again. He is a god, George breathed. Generous, thoughtful, always looking out for others. He is the perfect man, Fred added. Well, actually, it was Ron's idea, Harry muttered. The twins turned to Ron and gazed at him with enough loving affection that he flinched away. Stop that! And don't forget Hermione, Harry added. If she hadn't taught me the spell, you wouldn't have a captive test subject. Hermione quirked an eyebrow when the twins looked at her. Generous, Fred said. Caring, George added. A loving and faithful friend. Graceful and intelligent, not to mention beautiful. Hermione smiled. Why, yes, I am. It's so nice of the little people to notice. When the twins fell to their knees and gazed up at her in adoration, she waved her hand airily and told them to rise. Is it my imagination? Ron asked frowning slightly. Or did she look as though she'd practiced that? All right, enough fooling around. Let's get down to business. Later that night, Harry pulled the elves aside separately and gave them their final instructions. They were not to fight. Dobby was to take care of the kitchens, Creature was to take care of their house guest, and both were to take care of the house. The Weasley twins were to be treated as honored guests, but no one else was allowed into the house without Harry's permission. If something came up that was not covered in his previous instructions, they were to contact him. September 1st, Platform 934 Remus watched the express pull out and sighed. Harry and his friends were off safely, though he would have felt better if he'd been on the train with them. They had been well trained over the summer, but they were still kids. He didn't doubt that they would do what they had to do in order to protect themselves. It was what came after that worried him. No child should have to kill to live. "Remus!" a voice called softly. Turning, he nearly scowled when he saw Tonks standing behind him. "Yes?" he asked coldly. Tonks shifted nervously. "I was wondering if we could talk," he shrugged. "As long as it doesn't take too long. What do you want?" She looked around at the people still milling about the platform, then at him. "Perhaps someplace more private. I don't have time." "Say what you need to say." She scowled and moved closer. "Look, Remus, I know you're angry at Dumbledore for some reason, but why are you being so cold to me? Are you still a member of the Order?" he asked. "Yes, of course. There's your answer." "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, confused. "It means that because I followed Dumbledore, never questioning his actions or orders, I nearly helped him kill the person most important to me." "What are you talking about?" "Harry has been abused by his relatives since Dumbledore dumped him on their doorstep, Tonks. He has suffered at their hands with Dumbledore's full knowledge. He needed Harry to be timid and easily influenced. He needed someone gullible enough to walk willingly to his own slaughter." Realizing his was raising his voice, he growled and raked a hand through his hair. "Look, there's no point in this. You're so enthralled by Dumbledore that you're unable to see past the image the public has built around him. All you need to understand is that Harry comes before anything else in my life. And anyone who follows Dumbledore is a threat to Harry. Consider this your only warning, Tonks. Whatever orders Dumbledore gives you, if they concern Harry in any way, you'll face me." He turned away from her and took a few steps, then paused. Looking over his shoulder, he met her eyes. "And if that happens, you won't like the results." As he walked away, Tonks hugged herself tightly and shivered. "Hogwarts Express. She's afraid," Ron said quietly once Hermione had left to use the bathroom. "She's trying to hide it, but it's plain to see. I can't say I blame her," Harry replied as he walked at the door for privacy. "As bad as the Ministry is, even I didn't think they'd release all the Death Eaters they captured in the dome. And while I don't think Dolohov would actually come after her, the possibility is there." Ron looked out the window. The disgust he felt plain on his face. "I tried to ask Dad about it at the station, but all he wanted to do was lecture me about how much I'd worried Mum over the summer. She looked torn between wanting to squeeze the stuffing out of you or locking you up someplace safe," Harry said. "She still hasn't made up her mind. The twins were able to pull her off of me just in time, or I would have missed the train." Turning to face his best friend, he scowled. "And don't think I didn't notice you bolting for the train the moment you saw her, either. You could have stayed around to help. Now, what kind of student would I be if I'd done that?" Harry asked, his eyes dancing. "Moody taught us that it's better to retreat from a losing battle than to stick it out and die." "Asshole," Ron muttered. "Isn't there a prefect meeting?" Harry asked, changing the subject. "Yeah, later. Not that it matters." "What do you mean?" Ron shook his head. "Come on, Harry. Once Operation Overthrow goes into full swing, do you honestly think Hermione and I will get to keep our badges?" Harry's expression became unreadable. "I hadn't thought of that." "Don't be. Hermione and I talked about it over the summer. You're more important than any badge. You should know that by now." He looked away, his face tight. "Maybe, but you've both given up a lot for me. Not just for you, and you would have done the same," Ron said impatiently. "Let's not start with the brooding, please. Now, back to Dolohov. Is there anything we can do to help Hermione? I don't know, but it does prove Moody was right. Capturing Death Eaters only means you have to face them again." "Well, we took care of the biggest problem. Isn't there something we could do about his toadies? Something just as vicious, only without the long-term care involved?" Harry shrugged. "Like what? I don't know. Summon Dolohov to us, and we'll use him as a target dummy for the day," Harry said. But keeping that a secret might be a little difficult. Besides, I think we want a more permanent solution. And not just for Dolokhov either. Tom isn't a problem any longer, but his minions might still be. Moody must have rubbed off on me more than I realized, Ron muttered. Interestingly enough, I find that I no longer have a problem with the idea of killing Death Eaters. I can't argue with you there. I'm not sure I like the idea, but I figure introspection and soul-searching can come later. Right now, I think we need to come up with a few ideas to fix the Ministry's mistake, right? Harry remained silent for a few moments, letting the rocking of the train soothe him a bit. Ron? He finally asked quietly. How do you feel about being a bit late to school this year? Ron's eyes narrowed. What do you have in mind? An accident, Harry said. A tragic, unexplained accident. Standing, Harry opened the compartment door and stepped out, Ron following behind him. Hermione entered the compartment a few minutes later and frowned at finding the boys gone. Shrugging, she pulled out a book, figuring they'd went to hunt down the food cart. When the door slid open, she looked up and smiled at Ginny, Neville, and Luna. I'm surprised. I thought the three of you would join us as soon as you got on board. We thought we'd give you some privacy, Ginny told her as she flopped down next to her, then put a privacy charm on the door. And we wanted to speak to some of the others, Neville added. A few wanted to rush in here and talk to Harry about Operation Overthrow. How was your summer, Hermione? Luna asked, sitting down across from her. Productive, Hermione answered honestly. And yours? Very interesting, Luna said as she gazed calmly out the window. I've never overthrown a school before, and I find myself rather excited by the whole idea. Ginny grinned. Yeah, me too. And the fact that we have an honest reason for wanting to do so just makes it that much better. Neville snickered and sat down next to Luna. Ginny, Hermione said reprovingly. Don't start, Hermione, Ginny interrupted. Don't think for one moment that I don't know that this was your idea, Hermione squawked. Oh, I'm sure Harry had no plans on cooperation with Dumbledore, but to get the day involved, no, that had to be your idea, the redhead told her. Harry's too private. He wouldn't have even thought of it, Luna added. And it was a good idea, Neville chimed in. When the Golden Trio has a good idea, that generally means you came up with it and browbeat the other two into following through with it. Hermione opened her mouth to protest when the train suddenly braked hard, sending her and Ginny flying at Neville and Luna. Neville managed to catch Ginny and hold on to her, but Hermione slammed into Luna with some force, and both girls grunted at the impact. What on earth? Hermione muttered as the train slid to a stop. I've no idea, Ginny said, climbing out of Neville's arms. Nice catch, though, Neville. Thanks. No problem, he told her. Is everyone all right? Bruised, I think, Luna mumbled a bit groggily. Hermione's elbow had struck her temple, and she felt a bit woozy. Hermione looked at her worriedly. Did I hurt you? Not purposely. No, the blonde said as she held her head. Nev, Hermione said as she climbed to her feet. Keep an eye on her, would you? I want to find out what's going on. As Neville moved to examine Luna, Hermione slid the compartment door open and looked around at the sea of faces doing the same thing she was. The babble of excited voices and a few cries of pain were heard up and down the train car. Adjusting her prefect badge, she stepped out of the compartment. Everyone get back into your compartments. If someone is hurt, find a prefect or send someone to the front of the train to report it. Glaring around, she then nodded as the other students began to comply. Making her way to the front of the train, she ran into Harry. Where have you been? Are you all right? What's going on? Yes, I'm fine. There's been an accident. All prefects are to report to the front of the train. Ron's already there. I guess they've called in auras. I'm sure you'll know more than most students in a few minutes. I've been ordered back to the compartment. Ordered, she asked. By whom? Malfoy, Harry spat. Why they made him a prefect, I'll never know, but it gave the little ferret great pleasure to order me about. Asshole! Neville, Ginny, and Luna are in the compartment. I think Luna might be hurt. If she is, make sure to send someone to the front of the train when the auras get here, she told him. I'll see you when I can. When she entered the prefect compartment, she glanced around at the babbling group and spotted Ron. Moving toward him, she paused long enough to report Luna's possible injury to Cho Chang, who'd been named head girl. What happened? She asked Ron when she reached him. The train hit something, he said, shrugging. Did you see Harry? Yes. He said Malfoy had ordered him to go back to the compartment. Ron scowled. I'm sure he loved being able to do that. Probably. Looking around, she frowned slightly. Any idea how long we have to wait? It should be. The sound of many people apparating cut him off. Maybe now we'll find out what's going on, Hermione said impatiently. We're going to be late as it is. I doubt they'll hold us here long, Ron said placidly. They'll want to get us all to the school as quickly as possible. Hermione looked at him closely for a few moments. All right, Ronald. What's going on? What do you mean? I mean, you're acting suspiciously uninterested in what's happening. Normally, you'd be demanding answers. To anyone who doesn't know you better, you look as though you couldn't care less. Oh, I care. This accident is going to delay our arrival, which means dinner's going to be late, he frowned. I hate that, Ron, she growled warningly. He looked at her for a moment, then gazed around the room full of prefects meaningfully. We'll discuss it later, Hermione. Sighing, she sunk down on the chair next to his. You bet your ass we will. I hate it when you two do things like this without telling me, she muttered. Think of it this way. It saved a lot of arguing, he told her cheerfully. I heard once that it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. Turns out it's true. Almost 2 hours later, the Hogwarts Express was rocketing through the evening gloom. Being behind schedule, the engineer had poured the proverbial magical coals to the engine, trying to make up time. The Aurors had tried to keep the students ignorant of what had actually happened, but that was impossible. Every compartment in each car was full of students, all trying to puzzle out why a known but exonerated Death Eater would throw himself in front of a moving train. As suicides went, it was spectacular, and many Muggle-born and half-bloods speculated that he wished to go out with a real splash. The purebloods were not amused. When Hermione and Ron had finally returned to their compartment, Harry had glanced at Ron for a moment and then shared a rather wicked, if grim, smile. That was all the confirmation Hermione needed. She had, after all, already witnessed their rather unique, if disgusting, use of the summoning charm. Putting it together wasn't that difficult, and she found herself unwilling to berate them for summoning Dolohov to the Express. If they miscalculated and actually summoned him to the tracks in front of the moving train, who was she to complain? The man had tried to kill her, after all. She blinked at the directions her thoughts were taking, and seriously began to wonder where the law-abiding girl she'd once been had disappeared to. She, like the others in the compartment, looked up when the door slid open. No trip on the train is complete without a visit from the ferret, Ron quipped as he looked at Draco Malfoy and his two goons. I didn't think they allowed ferrets, Ginny said. Toads, owls, or cats. I believe, but not ferrets. Shut it, Weasel, Draco snarled. A ferret is a member of the weasel family, Luna told him seriously. You should be nicer to your relatives. When everyone stared at her, she blinked owlishly. What? She asked. Weasels are quick, cunning, and can be vicious when the situation calls for it. All things so admired by Slytherin House but seem to be missing in recent years. I always assumed the ferret was jealous of Ron and Ginny for having the qualities he and his whole house so obviously lack. What are you talking about? Draco sputtered furiously. She means you've become predictable, Neville said. Every year you come in, make some snide comments, a couple of threats, then leave. Which one is it this year, Malfoy? Well, if it isn't Scarhead, the Mudblood and the Weasel, you'll get yours, Potter. Or wait until my father hears about this, Potter. You're forgetting the ever-popular The Dark Lord will kill you, Potter, Harry added. Right, can't forget that one, Neville said, nodding. I think that about covers it, Hermione said. And since we've done your job for you, Draco, with a flick of her wand, she closed the compartment door in Draco's face and locked it. The 6 people in the compartment looked at each other, then began to laugh. Bob's note I had something, but after giving it to Dazza, 20s of penicillin took care of it for me.